Welcome to the live web conference, Limited English Proficiency Plan Work Group. I would now like to turn the conference over to Neha Hewitt. Please go ahead.
Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you so much for letting me come give you a basic limited English proficiency training. This training is called Improving Access to Federally Conducted and Federally Assisted Programs and Activities. My name is Neha Hewitt. I'm an attorney advisor at the Office of the General Counsel, Civil Rights, Labor, and Employment Law Policy section. My section deals with giving managers, supervisors, and agencies all across USDA advice, training, support regarding employment law policies, discrimination, and, of course, issues involving limited English proficiency. I'd like to start out with discussing a little bit of background on who is a person with limited English proficiency. Most people living in the United States read, write, speak, and understand English. There are many people, however, for whom English is not their primary language. Just to give you a little background, based on the 2000 census, over 26 million individuals speak Spanish, over 10 million speak another Indo-European language, and almost 7 million speak an Asian or Pacific Island language at home. If these people have a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English, they are limited English proficient, or LEP. According to the 2000 census, 28.3% of all Spanish speakers, 27.2% of all Russian speakers, 28.2% of all Chinese speakers, and 32.4% of all Vietnamese speakers reported that they spoke English not well or not at all in response to the census. An individual who does not speak English as their primary language and who has a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English can be considered limited English proficient, or LEP. What protections are available to individuals who are limited English proficient? The Civil Rights Act of 1964, and specifically Title VI. That coverage is also extended in our USDA regulations. There is 7 CFR 15.3b2. And there is also the Executive Order 13166. I wanted to go a little bit more into detail about Title VI. Just go to the next slide here. Okay. So for Title VI, what we're looking at is the legal authority. Why do we need to help limited English proficient customers, people coming through the agency? Section 601 of Title VI states, "No person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." And 602 authorizes and directs federal agencies that are empowered to extend federal financial assistance to any program or activity to effectuate the provisions. So Title VI gives us the legal authority to go forward with the department regulations, with enforcing LEP guidance. The 7 CFR Part 15.3b again states that you can't treat others different, you can't deny individual service, financial aid, or benefits, anything like this on the grounds of race, color, or national origin. Now, when we go forward and look at who must comply and who can be found in violation, at USDA, all programs and operations of entities that received assistance from the federal government. So obviously USDA is covered by that. The recipients also include state agencies, local agencies, private and nonprofit entities, subrecipients, entities that receive federal funding from one of the recipients listed above. So if a state agency is giving out money to another subrecipient, they are also covered. They also have to comply with federal regulations. All programs and operations of the federal government also must apply. What brought this about? What is the basis as to why Title VI applies to limited English proficiency? One important fundamental case evolved the entire law that is set in all our guidance that we have. It's Lau v. Nichols. It's a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1974. And this was a class action brought by non-English speaking students of Chinese origin against the San Francisco School District, seeking relief against unequal educational opportunities. The district only offered instruction in English, and they had a large population of Chinese students who did not speak English. They did not have any accommodations for these students. They did not offer ESL instruction that could help them receive the benefits of education. The school district received federal financial assistance. So the violations that were brought against them were the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, what we mentioned before, Title VI. The Supreme Court decided the case solely on the basis of Title VI, and that's why when you look at the legal authority for everything we do in LEP, we're really going to focus on Title VI. The Supreme Court held that the school system's failure to provide Chinese-speaking students with English language instruction denied them meaningful opportunity to participate in the public educational program in violation of Title VI and the applicable HEW regulations. The school district was required to take reasonable steps to provide students with a meaningful opportunity to participate in federally funded educational programs. So that case determined basically that LEP, the failure to ensure LEP persons can effectively participate in or benefit from federally assisted programs and activities may constitute national origin discrimination. And that's how it falls under Title VI. So when we don't provide LEP persons with the ability to effectively participate in our programs, then it could be found by a court of law that we are in violation of Title VI and in national origin discrimination. That's where the tie is, the national origin part of Title VI. What about other federal agencies? Are they subject to Title VI? USDA clearly is, and we have our regulations that promulgate Title VI and LEP guidance. But yes, federal agencies have implemented Title VI regulations that follow the DOJ, Department of Justice regulations, and have consistently construed Title VI's prohibition on both intentional and disparate impact discrimination to require that recipients of federal financial assistance provide meaningful access for LEP persons. And to point out here, that's intentional discrimination. That means when someone would intentionally do actions that would cause LEP persons not to have meaningful access to the program, but also disparate impact discrimination, which is a little different, where you have a policy that's neutral that you look at on a neutral basis, and that policy has the impact of denying LEP persons meaningful access to the programs. So on both can be considered Title VI violations. Okay, let's look a little bit at Executive Order 13166. I mentioned that before. What is an executive order? An executive order is an order signed by the President that clarifies law or gives us even more guidance on law, and it is considered a legal authority. On August 11, 2000, President Clinton signed Executive Order 13166, improving access to services for persons with limited English proficiency. Executive Order 13166 requires that federal agencies examine the services they provide and identify a need for services to those with limited English proficiency. And also, federal agencies develop and implement a system to provide LEP persons with meaningful access to programs and services. So this kind of gives you a background. I mean, this started the conversation and ensured that DOJ provided guidance, that agencies started putting together LEP plans and their own guidance. Here, 1 second. Okay. So in this plan, in the executive order and in the LEP guidance that was provided by DOJ, based on all of the executive order, Title VI, the Supreme Court case, now we've developed a law, we've developed a policy, and how do we implement it? And one of the largest things that came out of this executive order was the four-factor analysis. DOJ has really nice guidance, if you look at it online, that will also restate this, and most LEP guidance will restate this four-factor analysis. So it's very important. Please pay attention to this slide. Recipients of federal financial assistance have an obligation to reduce language barriers that can preclude meaningful access by LEP persons to important benefits, program information, and services. So you have these recipients, and they have an obligation to reduce the language barriers. But how do they do it? What do they have to? How do they determine that? So the starting point is an individualized assessment that balances the following four factors. One is the number or proportion of LEP persons eligible to be served or likely to be encountered by the program or grantee recipient. So some programs are going to have a lot of people that have limited English proficiency persons in their program, and some may not encounter any. So you have to assess that first. Two, the frequency with which LEP individuals come in contact with the program. Three, and this one's very important, the nature and importance of the program, activity, or service provided by the program to people's lives. How important is what that program or activity is doing? How important is it to people's lives? Is it critical? Is it something related to disaster preparedness? Providing food, water, things like that, or is it something more recreational or more, entertainment, something maybe less central and important to people's lives? Okay. And four, the resources available to the grantee and recipient and the costs. So, a federal agency has very different resources and, resources available and different budget than, say, a small recipient, a small business recipient, a small local, community organization or something receiving federal financial assistance. So you really need to look at the resources available to that recipient. Okay. What's another step that has come out of this is that DOJ has requested and has given guidance to require agencies to develop a language assistance implementation plan. That's an LEP plan. And it's very important because an LEP plan basically sets out to address those four factors in the slide before this. The plan addresses them all, so it becomes easier for you to do the four-factor analysis and come up with strategies to improve language access. So the 5 steps in designating an LEP plan: you want to identify LEP individuals who need language assistance, and this is a pretty hard step that because you need to find out how many people need language assistance, what your population is that you're serving, who they are, how big they are, and what languages are involved. You need to identify the way the language assistance will be provided. Are we providing translation services? Or is it mostly documents that are going to be translated? Or we need a lot of people on the ground giving oral translation? What type of language assistance is involved? Then you need to train staff that needs to be trained. Not all staff will need to be trained on all LEP plans, but some will, especially in customer service or people encountering LEP persons on a day-to-day basis. Providing a notice to LEP persons, letting them know, hey, we have language access for you. The service is only effective if people know that it is there and available. And then you need to be able to monitor and update the LEP plan because communities change, customers change, programs change. And so you may have an LEP plan, but if you don't update it, it may turn out to be useless in the future if everything changes. And changes happen slowly, so you really need to incrementally update an LEP plan. So let's look at identifying LEP individuals who need language assistance. The first two factors in that four-factor analysis that we talked about require an assessment of the number or proportion of LEP individuals to be served or encountered and the frequency of those encounters. So how many people are eligible and how many encounters are happening. This requires the recipients and the agency to identify LEP persons with whom it has contact. So here are some ways to identify them. One way is to, and these examples have been given by DOJ. They may not be practical to your agency. These are just some ways. There's certainly more, and the work group is a great way to come up with more ways to identify these LEP individuals. One way to determine the language of communication is to use language identification cards. So those are I speak cards. They invite LEP persons to identify their language needs to the staff that they encounter. So staff can have these I speak cards with them. The federal government has made a set of these cards available on the internet. The Census Bureau I speak cards can be found, and I have the address there. Those cards can be useful as one way. Then there's also when records are normally kept of past interactions with members of the public, the language of the LEP person can be included as part of that record in normal records that that maybe the agency has, and those can be analyzed, and you can come up with some sort of listing or data as part of from that. You can also post notices in commonly encountered languages, notifying LEP persons of language assistance, and then telling them and encouraging them to self-identify to the agency or person that they come encounter with. Okay, 2, language assistance measures. An effective LEP plan would likely include information about the ways in which language assistance will be provided. For instance, recipients may want to include information on at least the following: the type of language services available, how staff can obtain those services, how to respond to LEP callers, how to respond to written communications from LEP persons, how to respond to LEP individuals who have in-person contact with recipient staff, and how to ensure competency of interpreters and translation services. And we'll talk a little bit more about competency of interpreters and language services in the next few slides. So training staff. Staff should know their obligations to provide meaningful access to information and services for LEP persons. An effective LEP plan would likely include training to ensure that staff know about LEP policies and procedures. It's very important that, especially if you have staff on the ground working with people that are with LEP persons, that they know that there are actual procedures to follow, if there are procedures in that agency. Staff having contact with the public are trained to work effectively with in-person and telephone interpreters. So how to actually call those interpreters, the number to call, what to look for, what to say to the interpreters to get the most effective interpreter. Recipients may want to include this training as part of orientation for new employees. It is important to ensure that all employees in public contact positions are properly trained. The more frequent the contact with LEP persons, the greater the need will be for more in-depth training. And staff with little or no contact with LEP persons may only need to be aware of an LEP plan, to know that there is something out there, maybe a contact number to call if something should come up. Providing notice to LEP persons. Once an organization has decided, based on the 4 factors, that it's going to provide language services, so you've done the analysis, you said, okay, we have to provide language services. It is important for the recipient to let LEP persons know that these services are available and that they're free of charge. That is very important. Recipients should provide this notice in a language LEP persons will understand. So if the notice needs to go out in several languages, then that has to happen. Examples of notification that recipients should consider include posting signs in intake areas and other entry points into an office. So when they're first walking into a certain office, right there in a visible area, not kind of buried behind other signs or, maybe sometimes on a side hall, they might put it where it wouldn't be visible to the public. That should be avoided. When language assistance is needed to ensure meaningful access to information and services, it is important to provide notice in the appropriate languages in the intake area. I mean, writing notice in English is not going to help someone who can't understand English. And that sounds basic, but it's important to understand. So that LEP persons can learn how to access these language services. Here are some other notice examples that have been given. Signs in intake offices could state the free language assistance is available. The signs could be translated into the most common languages encountered. They could explain how to get the language help. Announcements could be, for instance, in brochures, booklets, and outreach and recruitment information. These statements should be translated into the most common languages and could be tagged onto the front of the common documents. Working with community-based organizations and other stakeholders, using a telephone voicemail menu. So someone calls in for a service and they get the telephone voicemail menu. The menu could be in the most common languages encountered, and it could provide information about available language assistance services and how to get them. Monitoring and updating the LEP plan. Recipients should, when appropriate, have a process for determining on an ongoing basis whether new documents, programs, services, and activities need to be made accessible for LEP individuals. Now that, again, could be daily, monthly, weekly, depending on the program. In addition, recipients should consider whether their changes in demographics, types of services, or other needs require annual reevaluation of their LEP plan. Less frequent reevaluation may be more appropriate where demographics, services, and needs are more static. One good way to evaluate LEP plans is to seek feedback from that community where the service is being provided. In their reviews, recipients may want to consider assessing changes in current LEP populations in service area or populations affected or encountered, frequency of encounters with LEP language groups, nature and importance of activities to LEP persons, availability of resources, including technological advances or sources of additional resources, and the costs imposed, whether existing assistance is meeting the needs of LEP persons, whether staff knows and understands the LEP plan and how to implement it, and whether identified sources of assistance are still available and viable. So this would be done, I mean, these things, is something a recipient would do when they're in their reviews of an LEP program and what's being done. Okay, so let's talk about the types of language services, because there are there are different types of language services, and you need to be able to consider them when providing language access. Oral interpretation is the first kind. Listening to something in one language, and then you're orally translating it into another language. items to consider: the competence of your interpreters, hiring of bilingual staff, hiring of staff interpreters, contracting, having a contractor for interpreters, using telephone interpreter lines, using community volunteers, using family members, friends, and others, and finally, competent language services should be free. And we're going to go through this in a little bit more detail because we put that up there with caveats and how that works. Okay. The next type is written translation. So you have your oral translation and written translation. Written translation is the replacement of a written text from one language, the source language, say Spanish, Chinese, into an equivalent written text in another language, the target language, English. So items to consider: determine what documents should be translated, determine what languages apply, the competence of the translators, and then you also want to look at documents that are on websites. So, we'll go into a little bit more about vital documents and which ones must be translated and which ones you want to try to consider translating for what they provide. So vital documents, those are particularly important to ensure that they are translated into the non-English language of a regularly encountered LEP group, likely to be served or likely to be affected by the program or activity. So what is a vital document? This is the question I get asked most important. Is this a vital document? What is a vital document? A document will be considered vital if it contains information that is critical for obtaining federal services and/or benefits, or is required by law. Vital documents include applications, consent forms, complaint forms, notices of rights, disciplinary actions, notices advising LEP persons of the availability of free language assistance, written tests that do not assess English language competency, but rather competency for a particular license, a test for a job, a skill in which English competency is not required, and letters or notices that require a response from the beneficiary or client. Best practices: strong language access coordination and accountability. When you appoint an agency limited English proficiency coordinator, or in large agencies, a working group of individuals from different components to monitor and update the agency's response to LEP needs. You want to monitor agency compliance by ensuring staff cooperation and accountability. You want to conduct regular trainings on LEP access. All staff should be aware of your agency's LEP plan, especially those who encounter the public. Another best practice, effective needs assessment. So when we talk about figuring out who has LEP needs, you want to survey client constituencies and chart their needs by tracking LEP encounters, conducting focus groups with client constituencies, stakeholders, and obtaining customer feedback via surveys or other methods. Now for agencies, we need to be careful. There's not an actual data collection form that we can use. But we can use, in a compliance review for Title VI, you can ask questions about LEP persons that are being encountered. Also, in other surveys or when people self-identify or there's an encounter, you can talk to managers, supervisors, people in contact with the public, and they can all give you information via their own kind of tracking system. Using the information obtained from client constituencies to target language access efforts to priority services and locations. It's another best practice. Reliable access to disaster and emergency preparedness information. When you're talking about vital documents, when you're talking about vital information that needs to be translated, interpreted, this is a major area of focus. Disaster and emergency preparedness should always be a priority focus for language access efforts. Efficient resource utilization. this is interesting. Now, we want to share resources within and across agencies. Within USDA, we have so many different agencies, and we can use our partnerships and our interagency partnerships to share resources that will help us gain the ability to help LEP persons. Utilize bilingual employees effectively and appropriately. You need to figure out what bilingual employees you have available. You want to avoid assumptions about the competence and willingness of bilingual staff and provide language services. Once you have identified competent and willing bilingual staff ensure that they are strategically posted. Leverage community-based organizations for interpretation and translation assistance, provided that quality control procedures are utilized. So you don't want to just use any community-based organization. You want to make sure that the ones you're using are helpful, know the community that you're working in, are able to provide interpretation and translation services, but that they are able to quality control maybe some of the procedures we're already using. That's probably the best way to use community-based organizations, is to do quality control. So you have a translation service of documents, and then you can have some volunteers come in and make sure that it's still accurate or that it's working well. Okay, meaningful access to web-based information. And this is always a difficult area because technology is it moves so fast, and websites are constantly being updated. But non-English web pages should be a priority, not an afterthought. Make them easy to locate and navigate. And that's so important because almost everyone is online now, English speaking or non-English speaking. The non-English language web pages should serve as a one-stop shop for agency information. Web pages should be available in at a minimum Spanish and other top languages. Do not use or offer web-based translation services. Translations through such services have been found to be unacceptably inaccurate. So consistent enforcement of quality control standards. This is another best practice. Follow the suggestions above related to ensuring competence of bilingual staff, interpreters and translators, and the accuracy of web-based information and translations in non-English language, and reliance on customer feedback. Avoid ad hoc approaches when faced with LEP encounters by ensuring staff familiar with your LEP plan as discussed. So, you want to avoid situations where you walk in and here are LEP persons you're faced with, and then you don't have any plan or know what to do, and then the person that represents the agency is in a position that they're just trying some approach that they haven't really thought through. That's an ad hoc approach, and we want to avoid that. We want to have a plan in place, a number they can call if they're in a situation that is uncalled for or not thought about. But most of all, we want to think about trying to prevent those situations at all. If we know the populations that we're encountering, if there are ways to prevent ad hoc encounters, then that would be the best practice. The reliance on an LEP's individual, family, or friends for interpretation and translation, whether on an ad hoc basis or as part of your agency's general language assistance strategy, is usually inappropriate. And this is why. Generally, family and friends should not be used for language assistance except for in emergencies, because they can have conflict situations. You don't know what competence they have in that language, what they're translating, if they're summarizing, whether there actually is some sort of conflict in which they're maybe not acting in the best interest of the person that they're translating to. You just don't know. And so relying on family or friends is more of a worst-case scenario in an emergency and not something that you want to do as a best practice. Okay. Valuing community partnerships. Enlisting the cooperation of community and ethnic organizations for interpretation and translation assistance. Reviewing translations and non-English web pages for accuracy and tone. That's the big example that I gave you before too, as long as quality control measures are used. Community organizations can help federal agencies to determine their language access priorities by identifying the services and information most frequently accessed or in demand by various language communities. Community organizations can help agencies assess the effectiveness of their language access plan by providing honest feedback. And community organizations can be a source of good publicity for an agency language access effort by informing LEP community members and agency services and the manner in which your agency is striving to meet LEP needs. Effective marketing of language access program. How do we market this program that we now have, these things that we're offering? In order to access your services, LEP individuals must know about them. Market language access programs to target communities. Attend seminars, symposia, and community health fairs. Inform ethnic media and your culturally diverse media outlets of your agency's commitment to language access. Here are some creative approaches to budget and funding, because I think a lot of the questions I get are about, well, who's going to fund this? Who is going to budget? How are we going? We don't have enough money. And, you know, certainly when you do the four-factor analysis, you have to look at resources and funding. But a lot of times you can find creative approaches. If you chart LEP encounters and provide hard data in support of your request for LEP resources. So, you know, especially within agencies, it's not that your budget sometimes ends where you are. You have the ability to appeal for more money or appeal for money for specific reasons. So when you're charting LEP encounters, you can use that hard data to help in the inclusion for hiring of bilingual personnel, for example, or obtaining funding for interpretation and translation services. You want to tie your LEP efforts to the mission of the larger agency to enable the budgeting for it. Again, making it a priority, making it a mission-critical objective, okay? Especially when you have something like national security or emergency preparedness. Another best practice is the involvement in the federally conducted committee and other activities of the Federal Interagency Working Group on LEP. So you can always contact the federally conducted committee. There's the phone number below. And that's the DOJ Civil Rights Division Coordination and Review section. And that's in Washington, D.C., and it can, you know, they will have some suggestions, help, input, things like that. And they can point you in the right direction. There's also lep.gov, which has a lot of resources that you can look at. You can look up online community-based organizations, universities, other federal agencies. For example, DHS has some regulations published. Other agencies have regulations published. There's a lot of resources online and around because since the push for LEP access has been happening, more has been developed. And I have another resources for language assessment and planning tools. And of course, you can use OGC. We're always here to help in guidance with many of the agency-specific questions, especially complex situations, novel issues, things like that. We're always around to help.